December 14th, 2018 began like any other winter night in the quiet town of Larchwood, Michigan, where snowfall covered rooftops like a slow, silent blanket and the streets emptied before midnight. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there. The most exciting calls the police station usually received were about raccoons knocking over trash bins or teenagers sneaking out after curfew. That calm routine was broken at exactly 2:13 a.m., when a call came into the 911 dispatch center from an address most locals knew by heart but avoided mentioning after dark, 134 Willow Lane. The dispatcher on duty, a woman named Carol Hughes, pressed her headset firmly against her ear. At first, all she heard was a wall of static, a crackling sound that grew louder and softer as if something was breathing on the other end of the line. She checked the caller ID twice. The number was real. The address was real. But the house was supposed to be empty. Had been empty for almost 10 years. Carol leaned closer to her monitor, trying to filter out the noise with her trained ear. Then, beneath the static, she heard something soft. A whisper. Not loud enough to belong to someone speaking directly into a phone, yet not faint enough to dismiss as interference. The words were shaky, stretched as if dragged through fear. She barely understood them. "Help, someone, please." The voice sounded neither male nor female, neither old nor young. It carried a hollow quality, as if the sound came from inside a long tunnel or through water. Before Carol could ask any questions, the line cut out. Silence replaced everything. She tried calling the number back, but it rang once, clicked, and disconnected. She reported the call to the night patrol unit. Officers Daniels and Morris were closest to Willow Lane, and although neither wanted to admit it, both felt uneasy hearing the address. The Wilson family disappearance had turned that house into something like a local legend, though every officer knew the real details were darker than any rumor children whispered at sleepovers. Still, duty was duty, and both officers drove through the snowy streets toward the property, their headlights creating thin paths of light between rows of dark, sleeping houses. When they reached 134 Willow Lane, they found exactly what they expected from an abandoned place. Darkness, stillness, and the kind of cold that felt heavier than the air around it. The house sat back from the street, its shape barely visible behind two dead trees and a rusted mailbox leaning to one side. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dusty from years of wind and weather. But what made both officers pause was how perfectly still everything seemed. Not a curtain moved. Not a light flickered. No sign that anyone had lived there in years. They scanned the perimeter with flashlights, their beams slicing through the darkness. The doors were locked from the inside. No footprints in the fresh snow. No broken windows. No tire marks suggesting anyone had driven up recently. To them, it looked like the same untouched, abandoned property it had been for nearly a decade. Officer Morris suggested maybe it had been a prank call, someone using a spoofed number. But Daniel shook his head. "Dispatch doesn't glitch like that," he said. And that voice didn't sound like a kid messing around. Neighbors began to peek out from behind curtains and cracked doors. One man shouted from his porch that he hadn't seen anyone go inside the house since the Wilsons vanished. A woman wrapped in a blanket said she heard strange noises some nights, like someone walking around inside. No one stepped closer. Everyone watched from a distance, as though some invisible boundary around the property kept them back. The officers were preparing to radio in a report of no activity when a crackling sound came through their radios. It wasn't dispatch. It wasn't any officer on duty. It was the same static Carol had described earlier. The noise lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough to turn both officers toward the house again. The beams of their flashlights fell across the front door. Morris swore he saw it move. Just a tiny shift. A slow, subtle vibration, almost like something inside the house had pushed against it. But when they approached, the door was still locked tight, and the deadbolt hadn't budged. They were debating what to do next when Carol's voice burst through the radio, shaky and more urgent than they had ever heard her. "We just received another call," she said. "Same number. Same address." The line was clearer this time, but the whisper came again. The voice said, "Please don't leave." And then it hung up. The officers exchanged looks. They had been standing outside the house the entire time. No one had entered. No one had exited. No one had turned on a light or made a sound. And yet the house had placed a second call to 911 while they were right there. Daniel stepped forward until he was inches from the front door. He placed his hand on the cold wood. That was when he heard it. A noise inside. Slow, soft, unmistakable. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. He removed his hand instantly. The sound stopped. Morris tried the doorknob again, but it refused to turn. They circled the house once more. Every window was intact. Every door locked. No sign of forced entry. And yet something moved inside. Something made the call. Something whispered for help. Carol kept calling the officers for updates, but there was little they could say. The house was sealed tight, but seemed alive in a way neither of them wanted to admit. Morris radioed for permission to force entry, but dispatch told them to stand down until additional units and a supervisor could arrive. Without proper backup, entering a structure, haunted or not, would violate protocol. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling that grew inside both officers like a spreading shadow. A light snow started to fall again, drifting softly over the porch and settling on the officers' jackets. The whole street became quiet enough that even the crunch of snow under shifting boots sounded loud. Daniels kept staring at the front windows. Once or twice, he thought he saw something pass by inside, just a faint shape, a flicker of movement. But every time he raised his flashlight, the shape vanished. He asked the neighbors again whether anyone could have entered the house earlier that evening. They all repeated the same thing. No one had gone inside for years. A few added something else, voice lowered as if afraid the house might hear. Some nights, they heard the phone ringing inside. No one ever answered it, of course. But it rang anyway, echoing through the empty halls like someone kept dialing the same number over and over. Hours passed, and more officers arrived. They set up temporary lights that cast long shadows across the yard. The house looked even more sinister under those beams, its peeling paint glowing pale and ghost-like. Everyone had heard the 2 911 calls by then, and no one could explain them. They checked phone company records. They confirmed the number was still active. They confirmed the call had originated inside the house. But logically, that shouldn't have been possible. There was no electricity. No listed resident. The phone service should have been disconnected years earlier. By 3 a.m., the team was preparing to break down the front door. They were lining up, testing equipment, double-checking their radios. Then, just as Daniels reached for the battering ram, the porch light flickered on. It glowed dimly, weakly, but enough to make every officer jump back in shock. Someone shouted for the power company report. One officer swore out loud. Another raised his weapon, because that porch light had no power source. The electricity had been shut off nearly a decade earlier, according to every record. And then it got worse. At 3:02 a.m., dispatch radioed again, voice trembling. A third call had come in. But this time, the voice was different. Not pleading. Not whispering. Clearer. Sharper. Like someone standing closer to the phone. "Let them in," it said. Then the line went dead. Every officer on scene felt the temperature drop. The porch light flickered twice as if obeying a command. And the front door, still locked, made a soft clicking sound from the inside, like a lock turning on its own. No one wanted to go first. No one wanted to admit what they were thinking. But all of them knew the same thing. The house had just unlocked itself, and whatever was inside was waiting. To understand why the house calling 911 sent a shock through the entire town of Lochwood, investigators had to revisit the story that had haunted Willow Lane for nearly a decade, the unexplained disappearance of the Wilson family. Their case had become a strange mix of official police reports, half-remembered rumors, and childhood dares whispered in classrooms, yet no one ever solved what happened. What the officers discovered on that winter night forced everyone to look back at events long buried under dust and silence. The Wilsons moved into the house at 134 Willow Lane in the summer of 2007. Tom Wilson was a history teacher at the local high school, quiet and respected. His wife, Rebecca, worked as a part-time receptionist at a dental clinic, known for her kindness and patience. Their children, 12-year-old Emily and 9-year-old Grant, were lively and cheerful, the kind of kids who made friends easily. At first, everything about their life in the new house seemed perfect. Neighbors remembered them planting flowers, repainting the porch, and throwing a small housewarming party filled with laughter. But within months, something changed inside the walls of that house. It started with small signs that were easy to ignore. Tom told a coworker that the old wiring made the lights flicker sometimes, though he had already replaced most of the switches. Rebecca laughed about hearing strange creaks at night, chalking it up to a house settling after years of neglect. Even the dog, a golden retriever named Jasper, barked occasionally at corners of the living room or at the closed basement door. The family shrugged it off. All houses make noise, Tom reasoned. Older homes have personality. And for a while, everyone forgot about those odd moments. As months passed, the strange things grew more noticeable. Lights flickered even after electricians inspected the house twice. Doors closed on their own. The phone rang in the middle of the night, but when Rebecca answered, no one spoke. Sometimes she heard breathing on the line, soft and slow. Other nights she heard a faint clicking sound, like someone tapping a finger on plastic. Still, she tried to stay calm, telling herself the phone company must have crossed wires or left an old line connected somewhere. Tom grew more distant during this time, though he never admitted anything was wrong. He spent longer hours in the basement working on school projects, even though he disliked the cold dampness down there. Emily wrote in her diary that she heard her father talking to someone in the basement late at night. When she asked him about it, he simply said he was practicing a lecture. But there was something in his eyes she didn't recognize, a strange mixture of worry and fear he tried to hide from everyone. Neighbors recalled seeing the family less and less. No more gardening. No more porch conversations. The blinds stayed drawn. The Wilsons no longer waved back when people passed by. One neighbor swore she heard shouting one afternoon, followed by a loud crash. When she went to check, the house fell silent again. She debated calling the police but decided against it, thinking maybe it was just the stress of work or parenting. Inside the home, the tension only grew. Rebecca wrote emails to her sister, Jessica, describing things she couldn't explain. She talked about waking up at night to footsteps in the hallway when everyone else was asleep. She wrote about the feeling of being watched whenever she stood at the kitchen sink. She mentioned that the phone rang more often now, always at the same time, always with silence on the other end. Jessica urged her to see a doctor or consider moving, but Rebecca never responded to that suggestion. Then, in early 2009, Emily began telling her friends at school that the house behaved strangely around her. She said she heard her name whispered when she brushed her teeth. She said the basement door rattled as though someone was pulling on the handle from the inside. Her friends thought she was trying to scare them, but one friend later admitted Emily didn't look like she was joking. She looked tired, pale, and frightened. On March 21, 2009, everything came to a disturbing end. That morning, a neighbor noticed the Wilsons' car parked in the driveway, covered in morning frost. The kitchen light glowed faintly inside. The house looked quiet, but something felt off. By afternoon, the same light was still on. The car was still there, and no one saw the Wilsons come or go. 2 days passed before someone finally called the police for a welfare check. When officers entered the house, they found an eerie scene. Dinner plates sat on the dining table as if a meal had been interrupted. A pan was still on the stove, long gone cold. Emily's backpack was by the front door, ready for school. Grant's sneakers were neatly placed beside it. The dog's food bowl was full, but Jasper was nowhere to be found. It looked as though the entire family had stood up in the middle of dinner and simply vanished. There was no sign of a break-in, no blood, no overturned furniture, nothing stolen, no footprints other than those belonging to the family. But one detail made every investigator pause. The landline phone lay on the kitchen floor, its cord stretched as though someone had grabbed it quickly and dropped it in a hurry. The receiver was slightly cracked, and the dial tone buzzed steadily when lifted. It seemed like someone had tried to make a call. Officers reviewed phone records, but the last outgoing call had been made a week earlier. No emergency number had been dialed that night. The search for the family lasted months. The police searched the woods behind the house, dragged the nearby river, and interviewed everyone who might have had contact with the Wilsons. But nothing surfaced. No bodies. No evidence of abduction. No trace of foul play. It was as if the family had stepped out of their lives and dissolved into air. Without real leads, the case went cold. Friends and relatives held vigils, hoping for any news. They never got any. Eventually, the property fell into the bank's hands. Realtors attempted to sell it, but every potential buyer reported the same uncomfortable sensation during tours. They said the house felt heavy, like someone was still inside. Some said the phone rang while they were walking through empty rooms. One realtor swore she heard a child crying faintly in the basement, though she later admitted she might have imagined it. Nobody bought the house. Nobody wanted to live with its history. Over the years, the Wilson disappearance became a story people told around campfires or whispered during Halloween. Some claimed the family ran away. Others said the house swallowed them. Teenagers dared each other to touch the front door at night. Adults avoided walking near the property altogether. Slowly, the Wilsons became less like real people and more like a haunting memory the town had learned to live with. But the police never fully forgot the case. Every time a new officer joined the force, someone mentioned the Wilson file, warning them that Willow Lane was different from other streets. They didn't know how or why, but everyone agreed the house carried a strange, unexplainable weight. For years, nothing happened there. The house sat quietly, collecting dust, aging slowly with the changing seasons. The porch sagged more each winter. Rust crept along the mailbox. The windows grew cloudy and dull. The yard filled with dried leaves and overgrown weeds. By 2018, the house looked more like a shadow than a home. Then, on that cold December night, the silence finally broke. When dispatch received the first 911 call in nearly 10 years from the Wilsons' abandoned number, it stirred something old and forgotten in the town. People who had long buried the memory suddenly felt it return like a chill beneath their skin. And when the house called a second time, while officers stood outside in the snow, even the skeptics had to admit something deeply wrong was happening. It was no longer just an unsolved disappearance. No longer just a local ghost story. Something inside the house had awakened. Something that still remembered the Wilson family. Something that wanted to be heard again. And for the first time since 2009, the town of Lochwood realized the truth they had tried to ignore. The Wilsons may have vanished, but their story was far from over. Detective Laura Reyes was known throughout Lochwood as the kind of investigator who didn't let fear or rumors distract her from facts. She was calm, analytical, and methodical, the type of detective who read entire case files twice before taking a single step into the field. Yet even she hesitated the night she was assigned to respond to 134 Willow Lane. She had grown up hearing whispers about the Wilson family disappearing inside that house. She knew the house had stood empty for almost a decade. And she knew better than most that abandoned places rarely stayed empty for no reason. Still, when she received the report about the 911 calls, she forced her mind to stay practical. Someone must have gone inside. Someone must have figured out a way to reconnect the phone. There had to be a logical explanation. But when Reyes arrived on scene and stepped out of her unmarked car, she felt something she hadn't expected, something cold sliding into her chest as if the air itself carried a warning. Officers stood in small groups with tense faces, their breaths fogging in the freezing night. The house sat in front of them under the harsh beam of temporary police lights, looking more like a dark, watching figure than a structure. Reyes took a long breath, pulled on her gloves, and approached the front steps. She first walked through the exterior with the officers who initially responded. Each detail they described, the static-filled call, the whispers, the porch light turning on despite no electricity, made her narrow her eyes. She was not the kind of person who jumped to supernatural conclusions, but she also wasn't the type who dismissed testimony from experienced officers. She inspected the door herself, noting the lock was old but intact. When she pushed lightly, it didn't budge. She raised her flashlight to the windows, scanning each surface for signs of forced entry. Nothing. No scratches. No broken glass. No disturbance at all. The house looked untouched. Only when she placed her hand on the doorknob did something unusual happen. It felt warm. Not warm like a recently used appliance, but warm like someone had been holding it from the inside. She pulled her hand back, her heartbeat picking up. She asked the officers when they last touched the knob. They all shook their heads. None of them had touched the door since they arrived. Reyes stared at the knob again, trying to reason with herself. Old metal can hold temperature differently. Maybe her gloves made it feel warm. But those explanations didn't sit comfortably in her mind. She requested permission to enter the home. Once she received the go-ahead, Reyes stepped back as officers forced the door open. The old wood cracked, and the hinges let out a long groan. The moment the door swung inward, a cold wave of stale air poured out, carrying the scent of dust, mold, and something else she couldn't identify. The living room appeared exactly as one would expect from an abandoned house. Furniture covered in thick layers of date. Curtains stiff from age. Wallpaper peeling away like dead skin. But despite the decade of silence, the room felt strangely alert, as if it had been waiting for someone to open the door. Reyes walked in slowly, her flashlight scanning every corner. The beam caught drifting dust particles that sparkled for a moment before fading into shadow. She listened carefully. The house was silent, but not the peaceful kind of silence. It was the type that felt tense, stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. She moved farther inside, studying the walls, the floorboards, the empty shelves. She noticed that the air felt slightly warmer near the kitchen and colder near the hallway leading to the basement. The temperature shift wasn't normal. Houses didn't change heat like that unless someone had been inside recently. In the kitchen, she saw the old landline phone hanging on the wall, its beige casing yellowed with age. She lifted the receiver, expecting to hear nothing. Instead, a soft dial tone hummed in her ear. She frowned deeply. According to every official record, the house had no active utilities. The power was shut off. The water was shut off. Even the phone lines were supposed to be inactive. Yet here was a dial tone as clear as if the phone were brand new. She placed the receiver against her shoulder and inspected the wires. They ran into the wall, coated in dust and tangled with cobwebs. Nothing looked new or recently touched. But she couldn't ignore the humming dial tone. She hung the receiver and stepped back, her instincts buzzing like a warning siren. Something was off. Something was deeply wrong. She signaled for the rest of the team to enter fully and begin a room-by-room sweep. As they split up, she moved toward the hallway. Each step she took made the floor creak loudly, though the board seemed steady enough. The air near the basement door felt heavier, colder, and it made her skin crawl. She pointed her flashlight at the gap beneath the door. Darkness stared back at her. She reached out and touched the wood. It felt scratched. She leaned in closer. Thin marks covered the surface, running vertically from the doorknob down to the floor. They looked like fingernail marks. Long, desperate fingernail marks. Her breath slowed. She placed her gloved hand over the marks, sensing the grooves even through the fabric. Whatever made them had scraped with significant force. Reyes requested a photographer to capture evidence, but she didn't open the door yet. She needed to gather her thoughts, steady her nerves, and approach with caution. She stepped back and returned toward the living room, where she placed a small recording device on top of a dusty coffee table. She wanted to capture any sounds the house made once the team stepped outside. It was a method she'd used before in cases involving suspicious noises. She didn't expect anything dramatic. At worst, she might record creaking wood or a stray animal moving through the walls. The team finished their sweep after almost 2 hours. They found nothing living inside. No squatters. No signs that anyone had been sleeping or hiding there. No footprints except for their own. They left the place exactly as they found it, except for the forced entry point. Once outside, Reyes took a long, slow breath of the cold night air. She felt relief leaving the house, but her mind still churned. Too many things did not add up. The team wrapped up for the night. The house was secured from the outside, and the plan was to return in the morning for a more detailed forensic investigation. Reyes drove home with the faint feeling that something was watching her through her rearview mirror. She tried to brush it off. Long nights and strange cases often did that. But she couldn't shake the thought of that warm doorknob. That active phone. Those basement scratches. None of it made sense. The next morning, Reyes returned to the house before sunrise. Frost glittered across the lawn, and her breath floated in front of her like pale smoke. She unlocked the temporary police padlock on the front door and stepped inside, closing it behind her. The air was even colder than last night. She walked straight to the recorder she had left on the table. The battery was still full. The red light blinked. It had captured audio. She pressed play. For the first few hours, the recording captured silence. Soft crackles of settling wood. The occasional faint gust of wind pressing against the outside walls. Nothing unusual. Then she heard a click. The same click a phone receiver makes when it's lifted. She leaned closer. Her heartbeat quickened. A voice whispered something. A long hiss formed into words, broken and dragged and trembling. The words were not the same as the 911 calls, but just as haunting. Please, find us. Her hands tightened around the recorder. She played the segment again. The voice sounded distorted, like multiple voices layered on top of one another, speaking in unison. Not a man. Not a woman. Not a child. Something else entirely. Something that didn't belong inside an empty house. She walked toward the kitchen again. The phone hung silently on the wall. She stared at it. The plastic casing seemed colder today, almost brittle. She reached out and touched the receiver. The second her hand made contact, she felt a faint vibration through the plastic. She jerked her hand back. Phones didn't vibrate unless they were ringing or receiving signals. But it hadn't rung. There had been no sound. Reyes was no longer convinced this was a simple case. Someone was either manipulating the house in a highly coordinated way, or something entirely unknown was happening inside these walls. She contacted her supervisor and requested permission to bring in a structural expert and additional forensic equipment. She didn't explain everything she heard on the recorder. Not yet. She needed more proof before she risked sounding irrational. By noon, the expert arrived and began inspecting the basement and foundation. Reyes followed, watching carefully as he tapped along the walls and floor. When he reached a specific spot near the far corner, the sound changed. The wooden floor produced a hollow echo. The expert raised his eyebrows, kneeling down. He tapped again. Same hollow sound. He looked up at Reyes. There was a space under the floor. Reyes felt a chill run up her spine. She directed the expert to remove the boards. As they pried one up, dust billowed into the air. They pulled up another board, then another. A dark opening slowly appeared, revealing a cavity large enough for something, or someone, to hide in. The air rising from the opening was icy cold. Reyes knelt beside the hole, shining her flashlight down. Something metallic glinted faintly. She reached inside carefully, her fingers brushing against something wrapped in fabric. When she lifted it into the light, her breath caught in her throat. A small metal box, wrapped in a child's sweater. Inside that box, she discovered the things that would change the entire direction of the investigation. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the house stopped being just a crime scene and became something far more disturbing. And somewhere deep below the floorboards, something else shifted in the darkness, as though aware it had been found. Detective Mara Singh had solved enough unusual cases in her career to know when something felt wrong, but the house on Willow Lane had begun to affect her in a way she could not explain. It was not just a crime scene anymore. It was a living presence, something that seemed to breathe in the silence and watch her as she moved through its dark rooms. After the new 911 call came in with her own voice recorded asking for help, she drove back to the house before dawn, unable to wait for daylight. The sky was still a deep blue when she pulled up. Mist clung to the ground like a cold veil. The front door was exactly as they had left it the night before, one strip of police tape fluttering weakly as if something had pushed against it from the inside. When she stepped in, the air felt heavier than she remembered. She turned on her flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, catching dust floating like ash. For a moment she thought she heard someone whisper her name, but the sound vanished as quickly as it came, leaving her unsure if it had been real or just her nerves playing tricks on her. She forced herself deeper into the hallway, replaying the 911 recording in her head. The voice on the line had been unmistakably hers. Same tone, same urgency, same trembling breath. But she had never made that call. Someone or something had imitated her perfectly, and that was more unsettling than anything she had found in the basement. She walked toward the kitchen, following a soft hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. At first it sounded mechanical, like an old refrigerator trying to start. But soon the noise changed. It stretched into something long, low, almost mournful, like a distant cry trapped behind plaster and wood. She touched the wall, and it felt warm. The warmth pulsed, faint but steady, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. She stepped back, her chest tightening. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. She called an Officer Reuben Hale, the only person on the team who didn't mock her for believing in gut feelings. He arrived 20 minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes but alert enough to notice the tension in her voice when she told him about the hum and the warmth in the walls. They moved through the house together, her flashlight pointing ahead while they scanned behind them. The sound intensified as they neared the basement door. Mara felt her pulse quicken. The basement had already been cleared twice, but nothing about this case had followed normal patterns. She opened the door. The staircase was once again swallowed in darkness, thick and impenetrable. As they walked down, each step groaned under their weight, echoing through the confined space. When they reached the bottom, the noise suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the hum had been. It felt like the house was holding its breath. Reuben whispered that they should check the foundation walls. Mara moved toward the far corner where the concrete looked cracked and uneven. She knelt down and pressed her ear against it. For a moment she heard nothing. Then a faint voice rose from behind the wall. A woman's voice. Soft. Strained. Pleading. It said, "Help me, please." Mara froze. The voice was not muffled as it should have been if someone was behind solid concrete. It was clear. Almost too clear. Like it was speaking inside her head yet echoing from the stone at the same time. Reuben crouched beside her, but he heard nothing. She backed away from the wall, shaken, and tried to steady her breathing. She needed to understand what was happening, not just react to it. They began searching the basement again, inch by inch, and that was when Reuben noticed a line on the floor, faint but noticeable, like a seam. It ran beneath a shelving unit stacked with dusty cans of expired food. They pushed the shelf aside, revealing a thin rectangular outline. A trapdoor. They had missed it during the earlier searches because it blended perfectly with the cement, but now that they were staring right at it, Mara couldn't understand how they had overlooked something so obvious. She slipped her fingers into the small metal grip and pulled. The trapdoor lifted with a loud, jarring crack that echoed through the basement. A cold gust of air rushed out, carrying with it a smell so foul and rotten it forced both of them to cover their noses. A narrow wooden ladder descended into darkness. Mara shone her flashlight down, but the light was swallowed before it reached the bottom. She hesitated only for a moment before she started climbing down, her boots creaking on the old rungs. Reuben followed close behind. The ladder ended in a cramped underground room no bigger than a walk-in closet. The walls were made of old stone, damp and streaked with dark stains. A single bulb hung from a wire but flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space. In the center of the room was a small wooden table covered with scattered papers. Mara picked up the first sheet and felt her stomach twist. It was a log of 911 calls. Names, timestamps, transcripts. Some had check marks beside them. Others were circled in red ink. She flipped through more pages. Every call listed had originated from this house over the past 20 years. There were dozens. Many were labeled as unverified, no voice on the line, or caller hung up. But the most disturbing detail was the writing at the bottom of each page. The notes were handwritten, messy, almost frantic, as if the writer had been rushed or unstable. One note repeated on several pages read, "She won't leave. She keeps calling. She won't stop." Mara's hand shook as she turned to the last page in the pile. It didn't contain a list. Instead, it held a single message. "If you're reading this, she found you." Reuben stepped closer, his flashlight beam trembling. Suddenly a loud thud echoed above them, followed by a soft dragging sound across the basement floor. They both froze. Someone was upstairs. The footsteps moved slowly but deliberately, the weight of each step pressing down on the wood as though the walker was struggling or injured. Mara switched off her flashlight and motioned for Reuben to do the same. Darkness enveloped them, but it was safer than letting whoever was above know their exact location. They stood completely still, listening as the footsteps moved toward the basement door. The hinges squealed as the door opened. Mara pressed her back against the stone wall, trying to quiet her breathing. A shadow moved at the edge of the ladder's opening. They could not see who or what it was, but they could hear it. Slow breathing. Labored. Wet, as though the lungs producing it were damaged. Then the voice drifted down the ladder, soft and distorted. "Help me." The same voice Mara had heard from the wall. Reuben's grip on her arm tightened. She whispered for him not to move. They listened as the figure stayed there for several long seconds, breathing heavily, almost sniffing the air. Then it moved away. Footsteps shuffled across the basement floor and faded into silence. Mara waited 2 full minutes before turning her flashlight back on. They climbed the ladder cautiously, checking every corner of the basement before emerging into the hallway. The house was silent again. Too silent, and colder than before. Mara walked slowly, expecting at any moment to see someone standing in the shadows. But the house was empty. Or at least, it looked empty. When she reached the living room, she noticed something new on the wall near the window. Words scratched into the plaster. Fresh scratches. Jagged. Unsteady. "I hear you." Reuben cursed it under his breath. Mara felt the familiar chill crawl down her spine. Someone was watching them from inside the house. Someone who could mimic voices, hide in walls, and appear and disappear without leaving a trace. And somehow, that someone had known they were in the hidden room. Mara turned toward the hallway leading to the front door, intending to get them out of the house, but then her phone vibrated. A new notification. A missed call. From 911. She stared at the screen, dread rooting her to the floor. The timestamp showed the call had happened exactly 2 minutes ago. She played the voicemail. Her own voice filled the room, whispering frantically, "Mara, don't leave. She's behind you." Mara spun around. Mara spun so quickly that her vision blurred, expecting to see someone behind her, but the hallway was empty. Only the long, narrow stretch of wooden floor stared back at her, illuminated by a trembling flashlight. The silence that followed the voicemail felt suffocating. She tried to convince herself the message was a trick, a recording taken from her earlier interviews or conversations, but deep down she knew the voice she had heard was not something from her phone history. It was her voice speaking words she had never spoken. Reuben came closer, whispering urgently, asking what was wrong. She didn't want to alarm him, but she also couldn't lie. She told him the message warned her that someone was behind her, and his expression tightened with fear he tried to hide. For the first time, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Doubt not in her sanity, but in the safety of staying inside the house at all. He told her they needed to leave immediately, report everything, and bring in a larger team. For a moment she agreed. She wanted to run out of the house and into the morning air. But something kept her rooted in place. Something she didn't want to admit was not fear but curiosity. She felt drawn to the house as though a part of her needed to understand what was truly happening before she left. She stepped toward the living room window, trying to look outside. The glass was fogged from the inside, and when she wiped it with the sleeve of her jacket she noticed faint handprints on the surface, too small to belong to an adult. They were smeared downward, as if a child had been dragging their fingers along the glass. She shivered and stepped back, bumping into Reuben, who had followed her. Before either of them could speak, the house made a sound they had not heard before. A deep groan, like a massive weight shifting inside the walls. The floor vibrated beneath their feet. Dust drifted from the ceiling. It was as if the house itself was waking up, stretching, preparing for something. Mara steadied herself and said they needed to check the hallway. She didn't know why she felt that way. It was as if an unseen force was guiding her, nudging her forward. They moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting across the narrow walls. Halfway down the hall, Reuben grabbed her arm and pointed. A door that had been closed earlier was now wide open. It led to an upstairs staircase Mara had assumed was too unstable to use. But now the wooden steps looked strangely clean, as if someone had recently walked on them. Without speaking, they climbed carefully. The stairs creaked with every step, and the temperature dropped as they rose. At the top of the stairs was a long corridor with 3 rooms. The first door on the left was cracked open. Mara pushed it with her foot and the room revealed itself in dim gray light. It was small, empty except for an old rocking chair placed in the center. The chair began to move slowly the moment her flashlight landed on it. Back and forth. Back and forth. No one was sitting in it. Reuben muttered that they should get out of the room, but Mara stepped closer, drawn to a folded piece of paper lying beneath the chair. She bent down, snatched it, and backed away as the chair suddenly stopped moving, the sudden stillness more frightening than the motion. She unfolded the paper. It was a 911 call transcript, handwritten, unlike the printed ones they found below. The date on it was from 6 years ago. The transcript described a call from a woman begging for help, saying someone was locked in the walls. The final line read, "Please, she won't stop screaming. It sounds like me." Mara's pulse raced. This was the first clue suggesting the house had a history of mimicking voices long before this week. She put the paper in her pocket and moved on to the second room, which had no door at all. As she stepped inside, she realized it must have once been a child's bedroom. Faded drawings covered one wall, and a broken crib sat in the corner. The air here felt heavier than elsewhere in the house, thick with sorrow. She approached the wall drawings. They depicted a house, this house, a woman, a child, and something else. A tall shape with no face standing in a doorway. The lines of the drawing were jagged, desperate, as though made by a frightened hand. Reuben pointed to words scribbled above the drawings, barely visible in the dim light. "She copies me." Mara felt the hairs rise on her arms. The child who lived here had drawn these. She whispered that maybe the child had heard the same voice she heard earlier, The same imitation. The same presence. But where were the parents? What happened to them? The third room was at the end of the hole and had a padlock hanging loosely from the handle, broken off as if forced open from the inside. The moment they stepped in, Mara understood why someone had tried to lock it. The walls were covered with dozens of scratched messages. Long jagged letters carved deep into the plaster. Some messages repeated over and over. "Let me out." "She listens." "Don't answer her." But the most disturbing was the largest message carved across the far wall, almost reaching the ceiling. "The house is not empty." Mara and Reuben stood frozen, trying to process everything. Then, somewhere behind them, a soft clicking sound echoed down the hall. Footsteps. Slow, measured, and not trying to hide. Mara shut off her flashlight and motioned for Reuben to follow. They backed into a shadowed corner of the room. The footsteps grew louder. Something brushed against the hallway wall with a soft scraping, like fingertips dragging across the surface. The sound was unmistakably close. Mara held her breath. A silhouette appeared in the doorway. For a second, Mara saw the outline clearly. It was a woman. Thin, hair hanging in tangled strands, head tilted unnaturally to one side. Then the figure stepped backward, disappearing into the darkness before they could get a closer look. Reuben whispered that they needed to leave right now. Mara agreed. They quietly crept down the hallway toward the stairs. Halfway there, the sound of a phone ringing broke through the silence. It was loud and shrill, echoing down the corridor, bouncing off the walls. Mara tried to locate the source, but it sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Reuben pointed toward the first bedroom. The rocking chair was shaking violently now, and beneath it her phone lay on the floor, screen glowing. She picked it up with shaking hands. Another missed call. From her own number. The voicemail icon blinked. She pressed play. Her voice screamed in terror, loud enough to echo through the entire second floor. "Don't go downstairs." Reuben grabbed her shoulder, but before they could react, the sound of rapid footsteps thundered down below, racing across the first floor as if someone was sprinting toward the staircase. They froze. The footsteps stopped right at the bottom of the stairs. Something was waiting. Mara swallowed hard. She whispered that they would not go down. Instead, they moved toward a narrow window at the end of the hall. She told Reuben that if they could get onto the roof extension, they could drop down onto the porch and escape. He nodded, helping her pry the window open. The cold morning air rushed in. Mara climbed through first, gripping the ledge tightly. She turned to help Reuben climb out, but as he stepped through the window, something inside the house grabbed him. He screamed as he was yanked backward. Mara reached for his arm, gripping him tightly, pulling with all her strength. His flashlight fell from his other hand, clattering onto the roof. He shouted that something had his leg. Mara leaned in, straining against the force pulling him inside. She could not see what had him. The hallway behind him was empty, but she felt the pull. She felt the strength. It was like the house itself was dragging him back. With one desperate heave, she pulled him free. They tumbled onto the roof extension together. The window slammed shut with such force the glass shattered. They scrambled across the roof and dropped down onto the porch, landing hard but still upright. They sprinted to the police car, breathless, shaking, and drenched in cold sweat. Only when they reached the end of the street did Mara dare to look back. The house stood silent, its broken window glinting in the faint sunrise. And then, from deep inside the house, she heard her own voice calling softly. "Mara, come back." Reuben begged her not to listen, not to turn around. She didn't. But the voice echoed through her head for days afterward. The house was sealed off by the department later that morning. No officers were allowed inside. Every recording, every file related to the case was locked away. But Mara knew the truth. The house was not haunted by a person. The house itself was alive, feeding on voices, copying them, calling for new ones. And she feared it would not stay silent for long. Even weeks later, when she tried to sleep, she would sometimes wake to her phone vibrating. Unknown number. Voicemail waiting. And every time she pressed play, she heard the same whisper. Her own voice. "I'm still in here."